Sometimes the most effective thing a military can do isn't the loudest strike of the week. It's taking out the one piece of equipment the other side didn't realize was actually holding their entire strategy together. That's exactly what happened along Iran's southern coast this week. And I think it's genuinely one of the more clever moves of this entire war, precisely because of how little attention it initially got compared to the bigger strikes making headlines that same week. A lot of channels covering this war are going to keep chasing whichever single strike produces the most dramatic footage, and I understand why. That's what tends to perform well. But some of the smartest moves in any war are quiet by design, and I think this is exactly one of those moments. So let's actually slow down and give it the attention it deserves, rather than letting it get buried under louder headlines. I want to walk you through what actually happened, why the specific target mattered so much more than its size would suggest, and why Iran's own public claims in the days since have started falling apart under basic scrutiny. Every fact in this video comes from CENTCOM's own public statements, official U.S. Central Command social media posts, cross-checked reporting from multiple outlets, including Al Jazeera, CNN, the Jerusalem Post, and Israel National News, along with Iran's own state media, where it's directly relevant to compare claims. Where something is disputed between the two sides, I'll tell you clearly rather than picking a winner for you. Let's start with the target itself, because understanding exactly what it was is the entire key to understanding why this strike mattered. On July the 16th, U.S. forces destroyed a surveillance tower at Shahid Kalantari port in the city of Chabahar on Iran's Gulf of Oman coastline, east of the Strait of Hormuz itself. CENTCOM confirmed the strike directly in a statement posted to its official account, describing the tower as part of a maritime surveillance network that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had used for decades to track and target commercial vessels transiting the strait. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth personally posted a photo of the destroyed tower afterward, and CENTCOM released 35 seconds of unclassified infrared footage showing the structure disappear inside a blast and a rolling plume of smoke. Here's why that specific description, used for decades, matters so much, and why I think this was a genuinely smart target choice, rather than just another strike in a long list. A surveillance tower like this one isn't a weapon in the conventional sense. It doesn't fire anything itself. But it's the eyes at the very start of an entire targeting chain. It finds ships, it fixes their exact position, it tracks their movement over time, and then it feeds all of that information to IRGC commanders, who use it to direct missiles, drones, or fast attack boats toward whatever vessel they've decided to target. A defense analysis of the strike put it about as cleanly as I've seen it described anywhere, saying the strike ripped one of the eyes out of the IRGC's maritime attack network. Whatever weapons Iran still has positioned near Hormuz after months of this war, they just lost a long-standing, reliable source of surveillance data covering the entire Gulf of Oman approach to the strait. CENTCOM was blunt about the human stakes involved too, stating directly that destroying this tower degrades the IRGC's ability to coordinate attacks on what it called innocent civilian crew members, tying the strike explicitly to protecting the actual mariners who've been caught in the middle of this conflict for months. Think about the tactical logic here for a second, because I think it's genuinely elegant. You can spend enormous resources chasing down every individual missile launcher, every fast boat hidden in a coastal cave, every drone site scattered across hundreds of miles of Iranian coastline. That's exactly what much of this war's targeting has looked like up to this point. Or, alternatively, you can go after the single node that lets Iran actually see where to aim all of those weapons in the first place. Destroy the surveillance capability, and every downstream weapon system becomes considerably less effective, even if it survives completely physically intact, because it no longer has reliable real-time data telling it where a target actually is. That's precisely the kind of target selection that produces outsized strategic effect relative to the physical size of what actually got destroyed. And it's a good example of exactly the sort of surgical, high-leverage strike that a purely dramatic strike count can't fully capture on its own. There's a useful comparison here to how modern militaries think about targeting more broadly. Anyone who's studied air power doctrine will tell you that the most efficient strikes are rarely the ones that destroy the most physical mass. They're the ones that disable the fewest number of components needed to collapse an entire system's function. Think of it like disabling a car by pulling one specific wire rather than trying to destroy the whole engine block. The car still looks mostly intact, but it isn't going anywhere. A surveillance tower sitting at the head of a targeting chain is exactly that kind of single point of failure. Every missile battery, every fast boat, every drone launch site downstream of that tower still physically exists after the strike, fully armed and fully capable in isolation. But each of them is now operating with degraded situational awareness about where commercial traffic actually is at any given moment, which meaningfully reduces how effectively Iran can direct any of those remaining assets against a moving target in real time. There's also a genuinely new piece of military technology that entered this specific fight. And it's worth flagging directly because it's easy to miss inside a broader strike announcement. According to CENTCOM, this operation marked the first time one-way attack sea drones took part in this campaign. That's a real technological shift worth understanding. A one-way attack sea drone is essentially an uncrewed surface vessel packed with explosives and guided toward a target, functioning as a kind of naval equivalent to the one-way attack aerial drones that have become such a defining feature of modern warfare more broadly. Introducing that capability into the naval side of this specific campaign for the first time tells you the U.S. military has been actively expanding its toolkit against Iran's coastal targets throughout this war, rather than simply repeating the same strike profile month after month. An uncrewed system removes the risk to personnel that comes with sending manned aircraft or vessels into contested coastal areas, letting planners be considerably more aggressive about which targets they're willing to go after. That's exactly the kind of shift that tends to matter more over the following weeks and months than in the single week it first appears. The broader strike package that included the Chabahar Tower reportedly lasted around 90 minutes altogether, and it coincided directly with the resumption of the American naval blockade against vessels transiting to or from Iranian ports, which CENTCOM said went into effect at 4 o'clock in the afternoon Eastern Time that same day. CENTCOM released footage showing U.S. Marines from the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit conducting a verification boarding aboard a vessel called the MT Winyao in the Gulf of Oman on the same day as the tower strike. That's the blockade actually functioning in real time. American forces boarding and inspecting a specific ship to verify compliance, happening in parallel with the strike that had just blinded a chunk of Iran's coastal surveillance network. Put those two things together. Degrading Iran's ability to track and target ships on one hand, while simultaneously physically enforcing a blockade against Iran's own shipping on the other, and you start to see a genuinely coordinated campaign, rather than a series of disconnected individual strikes. A verification boarding means a team of armed Marines physically leaves their own vessel, crosses open water, and climbs aboard a foreign-flagged commercial ship, inspecting cargo and documentation to determine compliance. Every single one of those boardings carries real risk. And doing that on the same day as a major strike is a real demonstration of operational confidence. Now let's talk about the rhetorical fight happening in parallel with all of this physical action, because I think it's just as important to the overall story, maybe even more revealing about where each side actually stands. A few days before the tower strike, on July the 12th, CENTCOM put out a public statement that read almost like a direct rebuttal aimed squarely at Iran's own claims. The statement said plainly that the Strait of Hormuz is open to all seeking to lawfully transit the international waterway, that U.S. forces are positioned and prepared to ensure freedom of navigation remains available despite what it called unwarranted Iranian aggression, harassment, threats, and arbitrary declarations. And then added two short, blunt lines that I think capture the entire tone of this specific rhetorical fight. Iran does not control the strait, and traffic is flowing. That statement is worth reading closely because it's directly contradicting a separate competing set of claims Iran had been making around the exact same window. Just days earlier, following the third round of U.S. strikes that week, Iran's IRGC had declared the strait closed entirely, stating it would remain closed until, in their words, the end of U.S. interference in this region. Iranian officials told their own state media that the U.S. military had been trying to create what they called an illegal route through the strait. And Tehran claimed retaliatory attacks against 5 separate Gulf nations: Bahrain, Kuwait, Jordan, Qatar, and Oman, framing all of it as a direct response to renewed American strikes along its southern coast. So you've got two governments making flatly contradictory public claims about the exact same stretch of water at essentially the same moment. Iran insisting the strait is closed and will stay closed until American forces leave the region, and the United States insisting the opposite, that the strait remains open, Iran doesn't actually control it, and traffic is moving through it regardless of what Tehran says. That's not a minor disagreement over interpretation. It's two governments each publicly asserting a version of physical reality that directly excludes the other's version. There's an even more direct example of that same dynamic playing out just one day after the tower strike. And I think it's genuinely the clearest illustration of Iran's claims getting caught unprepared in real time. Following the strikes on July 17th, the IRGC claimed it had attacked a U.S. Special Operations Command Center at Al-Tanf in Syria, and separately claimed to have captured or killed American soldiers there in retaliation. CENTCOM's response was about as direct a public rebuttal as you're likely to see in this entire conflict, stating flatly and immediately, "Fact. No U.S. troops in the region have recently been killed or captured." That's not diplomatic hedging or careful no comment. That's an explicit, on-the-record denial of a specific enemy claim, issued within the same news cycle the claim itself was made. Whether Iran's Al-Tanf claim was a deliberate fabrication meant to project strength domestically, a case of internal misinformation, or some exaggerated version of a minor incident, the fact that American forces felt confident enough to shoot it down this quickly tells you something real about how unprepared Iran's public messaging apparatus has become. It's worth being fair and balanced about the other side of this specific claim, too, because Iranian state media didn't fully cave on every detail either. Iran's official news agency, IRNA, actually confirmed the destruction of the maritime control tower at Chabahar port after the U.S. strike, which is itself notable. Tehran didn't try to deny that the tower itself had been hit. But IRNA's own reporting pushed back specifically on the broader scope of the damage, stating that the port's berths, cargo handling equipment, and other operational infrastructure remained unaffected by the strike. That's actually a pretty reasonable, credible-sounding rebuttal on Iran's part. A targeted strike against a specific surveillance tower wouldn't necessarily be expected to damage unrelated port infrastructure sitting elsewhere on the same site. And there's no obvious reason to doubt that specific claim the way there's reason to doubt the Al-Tanf story. That distinction matters because it shows Iran's state media wasn't uniformly unreliable in the aftermath of this specific week. It selectively confirmed what was true, the tower's destruction, while pushing back on what would have been an exaggeration, broader port damage, and separately put out what increasingly looks like an outright fabrication regarding Al-Tanf. This is actually a really useful case study in how to read wartime claims from any government more generally. A claim about physical damage that's independently verifiable, like a tower being destroyed, tends to get confirmed by both sides. A claim about the broader scope or significance of that damage is where you start seeing genuine spin. And a claim about something considerably harder to independently verify in real time, like an alleged attack on a specific facility in a third country with alleged casualties, is exactly where you're most likely to see either significant exaggeration or outright invention. Recognizing which category any specific claim falls into, verified physical fact, spun interpretation, or harder to verify assertion, is genuinely the single most useful skill for following a war without getting whipsawed by whichever side's messaging happens to reach you first. Let's zoom out and think about what this specific week actually tells you about the broader trajectory of the fight over the strait. Because I don't think it's really about one single insane action. It's about a pattern that's been building for a while. This war's effort to reopen the Strait of Hormuz technically dates back to March the 19th, when the United States began a sustained aerial campaign specifically aimed at destroying Iranian naval vessels and drones threatening shipping through the waterway, following Iran's initial closure of the strait back on February the 28th, the same day the broader war started. Since then, you've had a naval blockade imposed in mid-April, a brief pause called Operation Project Freedom in early May, ongoing strikes throughout the summer, and a Congressional Research Service report noting that Iran's ability to mine or otherwise close the strait may have been substantially degraded by cumulative American and Israeli operations. The human cost across this entire campaign has been real too, with tracked casualties, including at least one tugboat sunk, more than a dozen merchant ships damaged, several abandoned outright, 2 merchant ships captured, and a dozen seafarers killed or missing, plus a port worker killed. So the Chabahar tower strike isn't really a standalone moment. It's the latest and arguably one of the more cleverly targeted entries in a 5-month campaign. A dozen seafarers killed or missing means a dozen families who've spent months not knowing about someone who was simply doing a job, moving cargo through a waterway that became a war zone. Merchant crews come from dozens of different countries, and none signed up to be caught in the middle of a dispute between Washington and Tehran. Every strike in this campaign is ultimately justified as protective of those people. And it's worth holding CENTCOM's own stated rationale against that actual human backdrop. What actually makes this particular entry stand out is the combination of 3 things happening essentially simultaneously. A genuinely high-leverage target choice that degrades Iran's entire targeting chain rather than just one weapon system. The introduction of a brand new capability, one-way attack sea drones, into this specific fight for the first time. And a rhetorical environment where American officials are now willing to flatly and immediately contradict specific Iranian claims in real time. Taken together, that combination suggests a level of operational and informational confidence on the American side that's noticeably different from earlier phases of this war. I want to be careful here about what I'm not claiming. I'm not telling you the Strait of Hormuz is now fully, permanently open in some clean, settled sense. Both governments are still making competing claims. The shipping industry's risk assessments have continued to show real caution. I'm also not telling you Iran's entire coastal surveillance and strike network has been eliminated. A single tower is one node in a wider network. I also want to be honest that a strike this precisely targeted doesn't undo 5 months of war that's already produced real casualties, economic disruption, and a diplomatic standoff that shows no clean sign of resolving anytime soon. One well-chosen strike is a genuine tactical win, but it exists inside a much larger, still unresolved conflict. And it would be a mistake to treat any single week's headline as evidence the broader war is meaningfully closer to ending. What I am telling you is that this specific strike represents a smart, high-leverage target choice. That a new naval strike capability entered this fight for the first time this week. and that Iran's own public claims took a real, documented hit to their credibility within about 24 hours of that strike, when CENTCOM flatly denied the Al-Tanf claim in a way that's noticeably more direct than how this war's rhetorical battles have typically played out up to this point. If you want to actually track where this specific thread goes next, here's what I'd watch. Watch whether CENTCOM identifies and strikes additional nodes in that same wider coastal surveillance network, because a pattern of systematically dismantling that entire network would be the clearest sign this approach is becoming a deliberate strategy. Watch whether one-way attack sea drones show up again and how their role expands, because a technology used for the first time often becomes a much larger part of the toolkit in the weeks that follow. Watch for further instances of CENTCOM directly rebutting Iranian claims, because a pattern of fast, specific denials would tell you the American side has decided that letting Iranian claims sit unanswered carries real costs. And watch how shipping industry risk assessments actually respond. Because the people whose job is pricing danger in this specific waterway are a more honest barometer than any government's public statement. A couple more things worth adding. Watch whether Iran attempts to rebuild or relocate its coastal surveillance capability, since a network that's operated for decades doesn't simply disappear from Iranian military planning just because one node was destroyed. And watch how quickly Iran's own state media walks back or drops the Al-Tanf claim, because a claim that fades away without further mention is a reliable signal it didn't hold up, even by Tehran's own internal standards. I know a headline promising something insane and an enemy caught completely unprepared is built to make you think you already understand the whole story. The real version here is more precise, and I'd argue more genuinely interesting than that framing suggests. A well-chosen strike against a decades-old surveillance node, a new weapon system entering the fight, and a rhetorical environment where one side's claims are now getting shot down in near real time. That's not spectacle. That's a war that's gotten noticeably more precise and more confident on one particular side over the course of just the last week or two. And that's the real story here, not the kind of headline that grabs attention for a day and then fades, but the quieter, more deliberate kind of military thinking that actually shifts the dynamics of a conflict over time. The Chabahar strike wasn't about making a statement. It was about solving a problem. How do you make an entire network of weapons less dangerous without having to destroy every single piece of it? The answer, as it turns out, is to go after the thing that lets that network see in the first place. That's the kind of move that, if sustained and repeated, can meaningfully change the calculus for both sides over the weeks and months ahead. Ultimately, following a war like this one honestly means resisting the pull of whatever single event feels most dramatic on any given day, and instead paying attention to the patterns that emerge underneath the noise. A single tower, a single new drone, a single direct rebuttal, none of those by themselves are the whole story. But when you start to see them as part of a broader shift in how one side is operating, both physically and rhetorically, that's when you start to understand where this conflict is actually heading, rather than just where it's been. So whether you're someone who's been tracking every twist of this campaign since February, or someone who's just coming to it now, the important thing is to keep watching the details that don't make the biggest headlines, because that's where the real leverage in any war tends to lie. And as this specific campaign continues to evolve, I'll be here breaking down what actually matters, not just what sounds exciting. Thanks for taking the time to go through this with me, and I'll see you in the next one.